What if the real horror of the Punic Wars was never written in the official chronicles? And what if everything you think you know about this conflict is only the surface of a much darker truth? Imagine standing in a world where empires did not simply compete for dominance, but where hatred became a weapon, sharper than any spear, and cruelty evolved into a political strategy. The Punic Wars were not just military campaigns between Rome and Carthage. They were a slow, suffocating descent into a kind of violence designed not only to win battles, but to erase a rival civilization from memory. And when you look closely at the fragments of ancient writings, an unsettling question emerges. How much was deliberately hidden? Long before the famous generals and the legendary crossings of armies, a wave of brutality was already shaping the fate of entire populations. Early accounts hint at massacres that were softened by Roman historians, rituals of revenge that vanished from official records, and political speeches crafted to justify actions no society would openly admit. When you pull the veil back, you start seeing a Mediterranean world trembling under fear, propaganda, and revenge. It becomes clear that the Punic Wars were not just a struggle for trade routes or strategic cities. They were a battleground of psychological warfare, terror tactics, and cultural annihilation. And that raises something important for you watching right now. Have you ever noticed how history tends to romanticize ancient victories, but silences the price paid in suffering? Understanding the raw truth behind the Punic Wars forces us to question how empires shape narratives to hide their darkest choices. What you are about to uncover may change the way you look at the ancient world, because the reality buried beneath the ruins of Carthage is far more disturbing than most textbooks dare to describe. You might even feel uncomfortable at moments, and that discomfort is exactly what reveals how deep these shadows go. Before we continue unraveling this violent chapter of antiquity, tell me your perspective. Have you ever imagined the Punic Wars in this darker light, or is this the first time you are confronting this side of history? Share your thoughts in the comments. It helps deepen the discussion and strengthens this community that values real historical understanding. And while you are here, do not forget to like the video and check if you are already subscribed, because what comes next might surprise you, and you will want to stay connected as we explore these hidden layers together. Now let us follow this thread of brutality and peel back what ancient writers tried so hard to bury, allowing the next chapter to emerge naturally from the shadows. As the shadows of the Punic Wars stretch further into the past, the origins of the conflict reveal a tension far older than the first spear thrown. The rivalry between Rome and Carthage was not born on a battlefield. It emerged, slowly, like a storm gathering strength over generations. Carthage dominated the seas, with a commercial empire built on maritime expertise, while Rome expanded relentlessly across the Italian peninsula with a discipline that bordered on obsession. When these two forces looked at each other, they did not see simple opponents. They saw threats to their identities, their futures, their very existence. This was a world where fear shaped decisions, and fear is often the birthplace of brutality. Long before the legendary confrontations, the Mediterranean was already trembling under the pressure of escalating competition. Small disputes between allied cities, minor clashes over trade rights, and diplomatic insults that might seem insignificant today began piling up like dry wood, waiting for a spark. Ancient sources hint that some of these early provocations were intentionally exaggerated by political leaders to justify stronger, harsher actions. In both Rome and Carthage, rising factions discovered that fueling hatred could secure power, and once that fire was lit, it was nearly impossible to contain. This manipulation of public emotion turned the Mediterranean into a stage prepared for an inevitable catastrophe. Behind every recorded treaty or broken alliance, there were populations caught in the middle, watching the tension grow with a mixture of dread and resignation. Farmers, merchants, sailors, and families on both sides felt the atmosphere shift as rumors of incoming. Conflict circulated through markets and ports. Some Roman texts subtly confess that early raids and acts of intimidation were never fully acknowledged, while Carthaginian traditions, mostly lost over time, may have contained testimonies of atrocities erased by conquest. What survives today are fragments, but when these fragments are stitched together, a clearer pattern emerges. The Punic Wars were seeded not only in geopolitical strategy, but in a growing culture of sanctioned cruelty. As the rivalry intensified, Rome and Carthage began preparing their societies psychologically for a future drenched in violence. Propaganda became a tool not just to motivate soldiers, but to desensitize entire communities. Stories portraying the enemy as monstrous or untrustworthy circulated widely, building an emotional groundwork that made extreme measures seem acceptable. By the time the First War officially began, both sides had been conditioned to expect destruction, to tolerate suffering, and to celebrate dominance. This mental preparation set the tone for the horrors that would follow, shaping the conflict into something far more personal and vengeful than simple territorial expansion. The foundations were now laid, and the forces of hatred, ambition, and fear had intertwined so deeply that escalation became inevitable. As these elements converged, the next phase of the Punic Wars took form with a violence that would scar ancient history and define the legacy of this rivalry for centuries to come, pushing the conflict into a realm where strategic brilliance and savage intent walked side by side. As the tension between Rome and Carthage hardened into open conflict, the figure who would reshape the moral boundaries of ancient warfare began to rise. Hannibal, a symbol of both strategic genius and unrestrained fury, embodied the transformation of the Punic Wars into something far darker than a conventional struggle for dominance. From the moment he swore his childhood oath of hatred against Rome, he carried within him the weight of ancestral grievances, turning every decision on the battlefield into a personal message to an enemy he believed deserved no mercy. His infamous journey across the Alps, celebrated in classical literature, often hides the deeper reality of what such an expedition required and inflicted. Behind the heroic images of elephants marching through snow and soldiers clinging to icy cliffs, there were scenes of desperation, starvation, and death so brutal they rarely appear in official accounts. Ancient writers tended to glorify the determination of Hannibal's forces, but traces of more disturbing truths still surface in scattered descriptions. Men froze to death overnight, animals collapsed from exhaustion, and local tribes who resisted the advancing Carthaginians were dealt with swiftly, sometimes savagely. This was not a glorious march. It was a test of human limits that carved psychological scars into every soldier who survived it, and it set a tone of ferocity that would define the next years of war. When Hannibal finally reached Italy, the conflict escalated into a theater of calculated destruction. His victories at Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and especially Cannae were not simply triumphs of strategy. They were demonstrations of what happens when war becomes a tool for vengeance. Cannae, in particular, reveals the depth of this transformation. Surrounded Roman legions were slaughtered without restraint, their bodies forming a macabre landscape described by later historians with a mixture of awe and horror. Some accounts suggest that the brutality shocked even seasoned Carthaginian commanders, yet the message was unmistakable. Rome would be made to feel the kind of terror it had inflicted on others. On the Roman side, the reaction was equally severe. The shock of Hannibal's victories triggered a wave of fear that pushed Rome to adopt tactics it once criticized in others. conscription intensified, punishments for cowardice grew harsher, and internal suspicions led to swift condemnations of anyone perceived as sympathetic to Carthage. A society that prided itself on discipline began to reveal a darker undercurrent, one that emerged whenever its survival felt threatened. Roman generals, determined to restore their city's honor, responded to Hannibal's brutality with their own forms of unforgiving violence, turning the Italian countryside into a landscape of burned fields, displaced families and towns forced to choose between obedience and annihilation. What unfolded in these years was more than a series of battles. It was a psychological contest in which each side escalated its cruelty to break the will of the other. The constant fear of ambush, the destruction of farmlands, and the knowledge that defeat meant devastation created an atmosphere where ordinary rules began to dissolve. Soldiers who once fought for glory or loyalty now fought to prevent their homes from suffering the same fate as those already crushed by the conflict. This shift deepened the savagery on both sides, driving the Punic Wars into a stage where strategy and brutality became indistinguishable. And as these confrontations continued, the seeds of even greater horrors were already being prepared, shaping a path toward acts that later chroniclers would soften, minimize, or erase entirely, leaving only faint traces of the cruelty that defined this chapter of ancient history. As the Punic Wars unfolded deeper into the Italian and Mediterranean landscapes, the violence that had once been justified as military necessity began bleeding into the lives of civilians in ways that ancient chronicles rarely dared to document. The brutality of these campaigns was not confined to battlefields. It seeped into villages, coastal towns, and agricultural communities that found themselves trapped between two empires willing to sacrifice anything for victory. Roman and Carthaginian writers both attempted to shape narratives that favored their own side, but in the gaps of their polished accounts lies a harsher reality, one where survival often depended on silence and submission. In territories caught between shifting lines of control, entire communities were subjected to forced displacements, grain seizures, and retaliatory punishments designed to break morale. Some records hint that when Hannibal marched across Italy, towns that resisted or hesitated were met with swift consequences. Their homes set ablaze, their leaders executed or used as public warnings. The Roman response mirrored this brutality. Determined to undermine Hannibal's influence, Roman generals targeted any settlement suspected of aiding the enemy, sometimes sentencing hundreds to death based on little more than rumors or coerced confessions. These were not heroic decisions made in the fog of battle. They were calculated acts meant to redefine loyalty through fear. Behind the grand narratives of strategy and leadership, there were families fleeing burning fields, elders forced into chains, and children left wandering among ruins. Ancient authors, writing under state patronage or political pressure, softened the details by shifting the blame onto the enemy, portraying these atrocities as unfortunate necessities. But archaeological evidence and scattered testimonies suggest a more disturbing pattern. Executions carried out as warnings, public mutilations meant to erase resistance, and entire populations sold into slavery reveal how cruelty became a language both sides used fluently. These actions were not hidden because they were rare, they were hidden because they were common. The Mediterranean, often described in classical works as a thriving network of trade and culture, became during these years a fractured map of charred earth and emptied villages. In some regions, the land itself bore the marks of scorched earth tactics, with fields intentionally destroyed to starve armies and destroy livelihoods. Ships transporting grain or supplies were intercepted and sometimes burned with crews still aboard to send unmistakable messages. To the generals orchestrating these moves, such acts were tools of war. To the people living through them, they were unforgettable nightmares, etched into generational memory. The silence preserved in many historical accounts reveals how deeply the elites feared exposing the full extent of these horrors. Rome, determined to maintain its moral superiority, often framed its campaigns as disciplined and just, while Carthage struggled to preserve dignity in the face of relentless demonization. Yet both sides wielded brutality with equal conviction, shaping a conflict where innocence offered no protection. The Punic Wars evolved into a test of endurance, not only for soldiers, but for civilians whose names were never recorded, whose stories were never told, and whose suffering became the quiet foundation upon which these empires built their glory. And it is in these erased lives, these hidden tragedies scattered across ancient landscapes, that the true weight of the Punic Wars becomes impossible to ignore, opening the path toward even more unsettling revelations about what both sides were willing to do in the pursuit of ultimate dominance. Now that you have seen how deeply civilians were affected, I want to hear your perspective. What detail in this chapter made you rethink the way ancient conflicts are portrayed? Leave your comment below so we can expand this discussion together. The siege of cities during the Punic Wars represents a phase of calculated horror, where strategy and punishment merged into a single, unrelenting force. Among these, the sieges of Saguntum, Capua, and other key locations stand out not just for their military significance, but for the depth of suffering inflicted upon those who had the misfortune of standing in the path of history's most formidable generals. Hannibal's campaigns were meticulously planned to break more than just armies. They targeted the spirit of entire populations, turning walls, gates, and granaries into instruments of psychological warfare. To resist was to invite devastation. To surrender was to risk subjugation, starvation, or worse. When Hannibal laid siege to Saguntum, for instance, historical accounts describe a systematic effort to deplete the city's resources while terrorizing its inhabitants into submission. Roman sources, seeking to lionize their own response, emphasized Hannibal's brilliance and the city's heroic defense, yet they often gloss over the daily suffering endured by civilians. Families huddled in shadowed corners, children went without food, and citizens who ventured too close to walls were executed or mutilated as warnings. This was a war that blurred the line between combatant and civilian, creating an environment where survival demanded constant vigilance, and every decision carried life or death consequences. Capua, later in the conflict, provides another grim illustration of how sieges became instruments of terror. Hannibal's presence in southern Italy forced Roman commanders to consider not only tactical maneuvers, but the moral and psychological impact on the local population. Retaliatory measures, punitive actions, and displays of military might were used to dissuade cities from defecting or supporting Carthaginian forces. In some cases, entire districts were burned, and captives were paraded as living warnings to neighboring settlements. These measures were not spontaneous, they were deliberate, rehearsed, and communicated to ensure maximum effect, a terrifying calculus of war that valued the message as much as the victory itself. The brutality extended beyond physical harm. The siege mentality imposed by both sides created a pervasive sense of fear that lingered long after the fighting had subsided. Rumors of massacres, stories of torture, and tales of disappearances circulated like a dark fog, undermining morale and breaking communal bonds. In this context, everyday life was weaponized. The anticipation of violence became as debilitating as violence itself. Cities were emptied of commerce, farms abandoned, and the social fabric strained under the constant threat of annihilation. Citizens were not collateral damage. They were psychological instruments, tools to be manipulated and reshaped by fear. Even when sieges concluded, the aftermath left scars deeper than any battlefield. Returning survivors often faced food shortages, disease, and the trauma of witnessing friends and neighbors killed or enslaved. The intended effect was achieved. The memory of resistance was overshadowed by the memory of suffering, leaving a population psychologically conditioned to obedience and submission. Both Rome and Carthage understood this implicitly. Military success alone was insufficient. The perception of omnipotence, the fear of retribution, and the demonstration of cruelty were equally decisive in consolidating power. As these sieges progressed across the Italian peninsula and beyond, the pattern of escalating cruelty became self-perpetuating. Each act of destruction demanded a harsher response from the opposing side, and civilians, caught between competing empires, bore the full weight of this calculated escalation. The Punic Wars were no longer simply a contest of armies. They had evolved into a theater of endurance, terror, and meticulous psychological domination, setting a precedent for warfare that would haunt the Mediterranean for generations to come. As the Punic Wars advanced, the systematic annihilation of Carthaginian territories demonstrated a level of cruelty that surpassed mere battlefield tactics. Both Rome and Carthage understood that victory was not achieved simply through military conquest. It required the total submission of the population and the erasure of cultural identity. The campaigns were increasingly characterized by scorched earth policies, widespread enslavement, and targeted reprisals against civilians who were perceived as aiding the enemy. Cities that once flourished under trade and governance were transformed into instruments of psychological domination, their destruction serving as warnings to all who might consider defiance. In the Carthaginian heartlands, the Romans perfected methods that were as precise as they were ruthless. Communities were stripped of food, water sources were poisoned or diverted, and citizens were sometimes forced into compulsory labor to support Roman armies. Families were torn apart, with men sent to fight, women consigned to servitude, and children sold or conscripted. These actions were not merely collateral damage. They were intended to dismantle society itself, ensuring that any memory of resistance would be overshadowed by the trauma of survival. Every act of cruelty served a dual purpose: immediate tactical advantage and long-term psychological conditioning. Hannibal, for his part, employed comparable measures when operating within Roman territories. His campaigns were meticulously calculated to inflict maximum disruption, combining military precision with terror. Villages suspected of harboring spies or providing aid to Rome were often destroyed, their inhabitants executed or enslaved. Fields were systematically burned to deny supplies to Roman forces, leaving civilians starving and demoralized. Hannibal's strategy was not simply to defeat armies. It was to break communities, erode morale, and impose a psychological toll that would make resistance seem impossible. Warfare became indistinguishable from punishment, and punishment indistinguishable from strategy. The use of captives, both as bargaining chips and as instruments of terror, became a common feature of these campaigns. Roman generals often displayed prisoners publicly to instill fear, while Hannibal demonstrated similar tactics by executing or mutilating those caught aiding Rome. The intentional suffering of non-combatants was normalized, codified within the accepted rules of engagement of the era, and rarely condemned in contemporary accounts. Chroniclers, whether Roman or Carthaginian, often framed these atrocities as necessary measures, masking the depth of human suffering behind rhetoric of duty, honor, or divine sanction. Beyond the immediate physical harm, the cumulative impact on societies was profound. Entire regions were depopulated, economies collapsed, and the psychological trauma endured by survivors influenced generations. Witnesses to massacres, displacement, and systemic enslavement carried memories that shaped the social and political landscape long after the wars concluded. The Punic Wars thus exemplified a form of warfare that extended far beyond the battlefield, combining strategy, terror, and the calculated destruction of civilian life in ways that would define conflict for centuries to come. As the conflict wore on both sides increasingly relied on these brutal methods to ensure compliance and dominance. The Punic Wars evolved into a destructive machine in which the line between soldier and civilian blurred, and where the true cost of victory became measured not only in territory gained or lost, but in the irreversible suffering inflicted upon countless innocents, setting a precedent for total war in the ancient world. As the Punic Wars dragged on, the treatment of prisoners became a terrifying hallmark of the conflict, exposing a calculated cruelty that extended far beyond the battlefield. Soldiers captured in skirmishes were not merely detained, they were instruments of terror, subjected to humiliation, mutilation, and long-term subjugation. Civilians who fell into enemy hands faced similar fates, often used to send unmistakable messages to their own communities. In the eyes of the generals and leaders orchestrating these campaigns, suffering was a tool, precision-engineered to instill fear, obedience, and hopelessness. Captivity became a theater where human endurance and psychological manipulation intertwined, creating a nightmare designed to leave no trace of resistance intact. Hannibal's campaigns in Italy illustrate the devastating efficiency of this strategy. Prisoners were paraded, sometimes starved or exposed to the elements, and occasionally executed publicly to demonstrate the consequences of defiance. Roman records, written from a perspective that aimed to justify or sanitize these horrors, often downplay the suffering inflicted upon non-combatants and captives alike. Yet when one reads between the lines or examines archaeological evidence of settlements abandoned under duress, a far more chilling reality emerges. The Punic Wars were a conflict in which the line between military necessity and deliberate terror blurred. The captured were more than victims, they were weapons against their own people. On the Roman side, captured Carthaginians faced equally calculated brutality. Rome's relentless pursuit of vengeance and control led to systematic enslavement and, in many cases, executions that targeted leaders and influential families. Entire populations were subjected to the whims of victorious generals, their fates serving as stark warnings to others who might resist. In addition, prisoners of war were often exploited for labor, forced to contribute to construction projects or military campaigns that directly benefited their captors, extending the punishment of the conflict into the very infrastructure of the empire. It was psychological warfare, social engineering, and punishment all at once. The trauma of these experiences did not end with immediate survival. Witnesses and survivors carried the scars of captivity into subsequent generations, shaping communities' responses to fear and authority. The constant threat of imprisonment, torture, or enslavement created an atmosphere of pervasive terror that affected both soldiers and civilians, blurring the distinction between those actively participating in the conflict and those caught in its shadow. The psychological impact of the Punic Wars was as deliberate and strategic as any tactical maneuver on the battlefield, ensuring that memory, reputation, and the very will to resist were broken long before the final blows fell. And while the stories of the captured were often suppressed or sanitized in official chronicles, fragments of letters, personal accounts, and later testimonies reveal the magnitude of human suffering inflicted. Families were torn apart, communities destabilized, and cultures threatened with extinction. Every prisoner held, every civilian coerced, every act of cruelty was a calculated move in a larger strategy to dominate not only land, but the human spirit itself. Now, after learning how prisoners and civilians were used as instruments of terror, I want to hear your thoughts. Which details struck you the most? Leave a comment below. and share your perspective on this hidden side of the Punic Wars so we can explore these dark truths together. The destruction of Carthage in the final stages of the Punic Wars represents the ultimate expression of calculated cruelty, where strategy and vengeance converged in ways that few historians fully convey. Rome's determination to annihilate the city was not merely a military objective. It was an orchestrated campaign to obliterate Carthaginian identity, culture, and memory. Every stone, torn from the walls, every granary burned, every household razed, was part of a larger plan to ensure that no trace of defiance would survive. The city became both a target and a symbol, a lesson carved in fire and blood for anyone who dared to challenge Roman supremacy. As the Roman legions approached Carthage, they employed tactics designed not only to conquer, but to terrorize. Surrounding settlements were systematically destroyed to isolate the city and deny it any support, creating an atmosphere of inescapable fear. Civilians fleeing the countryside found no refuge, as every escape route was patrolled, every harbor watched, and every bridge controlled. The siege itself was accompanied by psychological warfare, constant threats, displays of power, and the public execution of captives intended to break the morale of those within the city. Hunger, exhaustion, and hopelessness were as lethal as any sword. Inside Carthage, the residents faced a daily reality of desperation. Supplies dwindled rapidly, diseases spread in cramped quarters, and panic permeated every corner of the city. Roman accounts, often written with the intent of glorifying the victors, describe the final assault with pride, but archaeological evidence and later reports hint at a far grimmer picture. Homes were looted, children and the elderly were not spared, and families were separated in the chaos. The siege transformed a thriving city into a landscape of suffering, where the boundaries between civilian and soldier, innocent and guilty, dissolved under the weight of survival. Hannibal's earlier strategies had inflicted fear and psychological pressure on Rome, but the Romans, in their turn, perfected the art of total destruction. Carthage's defenses, designed to protect against conventional attacks, were overwhelmed by relentless bombardment, fire, and systematic destruction. The Roman goal was not simply to defeat armies, but to erase the city from history. Ancient texts emphasize the thoroughness of Rome's vengeance, noting that even sacred sites were not spared. Temples, public forums, and shrines were burned or dismantled, with survivors often forced to witness the eradication of their cultural landmarks. The final days of Carthage were marked by unimaginable suffering. The combination of starvation, disease, and relentless assault created conditions in which the human body and spirit were pushed beyond natural limits. Captives were enslaved, and the surviving population was subjected to humiliation and forced labor, as Rome ensured the complete collapse of Carthaginian society. These acts, while framed by Roman writers as just retribution, illustrate a deliberate campaign to eradicate a civilization. The Punic Wars culminated not merely in military conquest, but in a deliberate cultural and psychological obliteration, the echoes of which shaped the Mediterranean for centuries. By the time the city fell, the lessons of strategic terror, relentless pressure, and systemic destruction had been burned into history. The fall of Carthage serves as a stark example of how warfare was used as both a weapon and a method of societal control, leaving survivors and witnesses to carry the haunting memory of its horrors long after the legions departed. The aftermath of the Punic Wars reveals a psychological and social toll that extended far beyond the battlefield, shaping the Mediterranean world in ways that were subtle yet profound. Survivors carried the scars of devastation, both visible and invisible, into the decades that followed. Generations experienced trauma from the loss of family, the destruction of homes, and the obliteration of local economies. Children who witnessed massacres grew into adults who internalized fear as a constant companion, and entire regions were left depopulated, their social structures fractured. The wars did not end with treaties or the collapse of armies. They continued in the minds and memories of those who endured them. In Rome, the victories over Carthage created a sense of pride and divine favor, but this triumph was shadowed by the psychological burden of systemic cruelty. Soldiers returning from campaigns were often haunted by the atrocities they witnessed or participated in, yet Roman society expected them to integrate seamlessly, to celebrate victory while suppressing the horrors they had seen. Such tension between public glory and private trauma created a culture in which silence became necessary, and the unspoken horrors of conquest were institutionalized into societal norms. Power, obedience, and fear became intertwined, reinforcing the structures that had allowed such devastation to occur in the first place. For Carthaginian survivors, the experience was even more catastrophic. Entire generations were marked by displacement, slavery, and the destruction of cultural identity. Trade networks were severed, communities were uprooted, and traditional practices were interrupted or lost. Even those who escaped the physical destruction of cities carried the memory of betrayal, starvation, and violence. Oral traditions attempted to preserve the legacy of the fallen, yet Roman narratives often overshadowed these voices, framing the history of the Punic Wars in ways that justified Rome's dominance, while marginalizing the suffering of Carthage. The selective recording of events ensured that the trauma of civilians would remain largely invisible, leaving historians to piece together fragments from scattered sources to reconstruct the human cost. The social consequences were not merely emotional, they had profound political and economic ramifications. Populations weakened by war struggled to recover agriculturally and commercially, while the redistribution of land and resources by victorious powers altered local hierarchies. Families torn apart by slavery and displacement left communities fragmented, creating a generational ripple effect of instability and insecurity. Cities that survived the conflict often had to adapt to entirely new governing structures imposed by Rome, reshaping local politics, law, and cultural practices. The Punic Wars were thus not only a military confrontation, but a comprehensive transformation of Mediterranean society, driven by calculated terror and systemic annihilation. This relentless cycle of destruction, displacement, and psychological trauma set a precedent for future conflicts, teaching both empires and historians that the true power of war extends far beyond armies and fortresses. The Punic Wars were not merely a struggle for territory or trade, they were an exercise in the human capacity for cruelty and endurance, revealing the costs of empire that ordinary records rarely capture. The lessons of survival, resilience, and the consequences of unchecked power echo through the ruins, whispers of a history that continues to shape the human experience in profound and unsettling ways. As we arrive at the final phase of the Punic Wars, the full scope of cruelty, strategy, and calculated destruction becomes undeniable. The culmination of decades of conflict did not merely reshape borders, it redefined what it meant to survive in a world ruled by empires, unrestrained by empathy or moral restraint. The total destruction of Carthage, the relentless campaigns across Italy, and the systemic targeting of civilians reveal a war where human suffering was weaponized with precision. Every city burned, every population displaced. Every act of psychological and physical terror was part of a larger design, to assert dominance and erase resistance entirely. The Punic Wars were not only about Rome and Carthage, they were about the extremes to which societies could be pushed when survival, power, and vengeance collide. The lessons extend beyond the chronicles of generals and historians. They are found in the trembling hands of survivors, the memories passed through generations, and the cultural void left in the wake of systematic annihilation. Understanding the human cost requires more than reading ancient texts. It demands recognition of the strategic, social, and emotional devastation these wars produced. Rome's triumph was not achieved solely through military prowess. It relied equally on the systematic manipulation of fear, the destruction of identity, and the psychological reshaping of communities. Carthage, in its final days, became both a cautionary tale and a testament to resilience, its memory, preserved not in victory, but in the stories of those who endured and bore witness. For you watching, it is crucial to reflect on how these events were recorded, remembered, and often sanitized. The reality of the Punic Wars challenges us to look beyond simplified narratives of glory and conquest, and to confront the complexity of historical power and cruelty. These were not isolated acts of barbarism. They were calculated, institutionalized, and repeated in patterns designed to break civilizations. And yet even amidst destruction, fragments of human resilience shine through. Survivors carried forward traditions, memories, and lessons that escaped erasure, ensuring that the voices of the conquered could endure in some form, even when the victors attempted to silence them. Now that you have seen the full scope of the Punic Wars, I want you to engage and reflect. If you followed this journey to the end, leave a comment with "I've seen it all," to show you grasp the depth of this hidden history. Your perspective matters and helps us continue exploring these untold stories. If this exploration revealed truths that surprised or unsettled you, make sure to like the video and consider subscribing for more historical insights that challenge conventional narratives. There is more waiting for you. Another chapter of ancient cruelty, strategy, and human resilience lies just ahead. There's a video on the side that complements this story. Click and continue discovering with us, because history's darkest truths are far from over, and the lessons they carry are still alive today.